This is the Breakfast Leadership Podcast. Boundaries or burnout, you make the choice. Here's your host, Michael Levitt. Welcome to another episode of the Breakfast Leadership Podcast. It's Michael Levitt, and today I've got Paul Moore from Wellings Capital. He's also host of How to Lose Money podcast. Now, today we're not going to talk about losing money per se, but how to keep more of it and a variety of other topics as well. So, Paul, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you as well. I want to talk a little bit about your history. On your website, I researched your bio and saw that you went to Buckeyes country and also spent time in Michigan, so that's always an interesting dynamic to be on both sides of the fence. And then you spent some time at Ford Motor Company, and then after a short period of time left there. So tell us a little bit about the skills you picked up at Ford, and then what drove you to want to leave there to go on to bigger and better things.
Well, yeah, I went to Ohio State. I actually, my first mistake was getting an engineering degree. And then, for a guy who is not really oriented super a lot that way, I really didn't know what I wanted to do as a kid. And so I went on and got an MBA, which was actually a smarter move. And then I went to Ford Motor Company, like you said. And I learned that even though I really liked, and I still actually have very fond memories of Ford Motor Company, I could have retired this year. I was not cut out for big corporate life. I think I was cut out to be an entrepreneur. And so because after a few months at Ford, my friend and I, who both went to Ohio State, were plotting and scheming to try to start a company. And about 4.5 years later, we finally started an HR outsourcing firm. We quit Ford Motor Company, and the rest is history. We sold that company 5 years later to a publicly traded firm. I moved to the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia and started flipping houses and buying and selling high-end waterfront lots, building some homes, did a subdivision, hotel, and all kinds of other things in the real estate sector. And I found out that being an entrepreneur was a lot harder than I ever thought. It was a lot more enjoyable. I'm glad I did it. But I also found out that there were some temptations as an entrepreneur that I never had at Ford. One thing, they say that entrepreneurs have tremendous freedom. And I love the freedom I have. They say we have the freedom to work any 80 hours a week we choose. Well, that's not a great idea. But I didn't know that. And I spent years working, before even iPhones and laptops, I was working almost every spare minute. And I've got 4 kids, and thankfully they're all doing really, really well. But sometimes I think it's a miracle that they are, because I really was a very driven type A person and found it hard to slow down. So that's been one thing I've really had to learn. And I appreciate your podcast, Michael, because you're teaching that.
Well, thank you for that. And yeah, it was a hard lesson for me as well. My experiences and being driven and working, I think I selected the 80 hours, and I think I probably grabbed an extra 20 just in case on some weeks, because it just felt like I never shut down, and it caught up with me and was quite costly. But thankfully, I learned from it, recovered from it, and now lead a much better life, and a life where I can choose when I'm going to be doing work, not as much as the 80 hours, but there are times where it bleeds in. Right. It's interesting that you launched the HR organization and sold that off, and then went into the property business and homes and subdivisions and things like that. What drove that? What was something that thought, well, wait a minute, I could do that and flip some houses and start going into the real estate arena? What drove you to that?
Well, I wish I had a great and really intelligent answer. And honestly, if I could have known 20 years ago what I know now, I would have definitely done it. But at the time, it was boredom. They say that retiring in your 30s or 40s is a great, fun thing to aspire to. It's not. I mean, at least it wasn't for me. I had a few $1 million in the bank, and I didn't know anything about the difference between investing and speculating. And I speculated a lot and lost a lot of that. And I was, a driven type A entrepreneur. And I found myself being really bored and trying to make up excuses for why I was sitting at home in the middle of the day doing nothing. And I actually became the most miserable most miserable version of myself, I should say, as far as a husband, a father, all the things I was supposed to do. I started a nonprofit organization, and that was fun. But a friend moved to town who had been doing multifamily maintenance for years, and we decided to get into, buying houses on the courthouse steps. We bought one and sold it just weeks later for a $24,000 profit. And we thought, this is easy. And we started doing that. And of course, we lost money on 2 of the next 4. But at any rate, that's how we got into it. And if I would have only known what the power of investing in buy and hold real estate, especially with a commercial syndicate or a commercial company that's buying and selling commercial real estate, the power of that is incredible. And if I'd have known that then, I think I'd be a lot wealthier and a lot happier, as far as, because I have struggled since I was 50 to rebuild a lot of what I had in my 30s. So
it's one of those things where we see the dynamics of corporate real estate. And in Toronto, where I'm based, especially in the downtown sector, we're seeing construction cranes, as far as you can see, because they're building so many condos and whatnot. So corporate space is actually becoming a premium in the city, because there's these new buildings that are going up are residential. They're not setting them up for commercial. So right. Your small and medium-sized organizations, if you want to be in the downtown area, which many of these organizations do for a variety of reasons, the entry fee is a lot higher than it was even a decade ago. So it's an ever-growing market, and I've talked with people in the past too. Even in down economic times, there's opportunities there, and you capitalized on them, and being able to buy low and sell high, as they like to say, and it made a big difference, obviously, in your organization and your growth. For entrepreneurs that would even consider going into something like this, once their businesses start growing, and they go, okay, what am I going to do with this extra cash flow that's coming my way? What would be the one thing you would tell them just to be aware of, and something that would really help them in the long term as far as considering this type of opportunity?
Well, I have a couple things. Number one, I would really think through the difference between gambling, speculating versus investing. And investing is when your principal is generally safe and you have a chance to make a return. Speculating is when your principal is not at all safe and you have a chance to make a return. And I think that the difference would be would be evident when you look at buying a commercial real estate property that's already throwing off income versus investing, throwing $50,000 to the bottom of an oil well, to a hole in the ground, hoping that oil comes back and pays you back. And maybe it won't. If it does, you might make 10x your return. But if not, you've lost your money. And that's exactly what I did on a number of occasions. Another thing I would consider is that commercial real estate done right with proper leverage, proper value add opportunities, the right operator, it has been and can return 15 to 20 or 25% annually in total return. And that includes cash flow, appreciation, principal pay down, and then there are also some tremendous tax benefits. Now, if you take 20% return, total return, and there's easily to document historically that's been a lot of things have returned much better than that. If you can take $100,000 and put it in at 20% annually, 5 years later, that $100,000, if you reinvest the proceeds, all the dividends along the way, and the proceeds when you sell, that $100,000 becomes $200,000. Now you can take that $200 and invested in 2 properties. 5 years later, 4 properties. 5 years later, that becomes 8. And, if you do the math, over 30 years, $100,000 becomes about $5 million. Now, when I say that, I run the risk, I realize, of sounding like a scoundrel or a scammer or something, but it's just simple math. And there's lots of people who've done this. In fact, a lot of the Forbes 400 invest in commercial real estate exactly in that way. They reinvest all the dividends and the proceeds, etc., and they do it tax advantage, sometimes tax deferred. And the ability to grow wealth is tremendous. So I say to a lot of people who are trying to quit their job to start flipping houses, don't quit your day job. Find $100,000, find $150,000 in home equity or somewhere else, and plow it in with a very good syndicator that you can trust, and let them do the hard work. You stay enjoying what you do well already, and this is a way to build tremendous wealth.
That's amazing information and advice on that, because again, finding that trusted advisor to help you with this and not just say, well, I'm going to go buy a building or invest in a building. Well, there's so many nuances to it, location, and of course, what's the value? Is there, other situations going on in that particular location? So many factors. So by being able to do that, and that type of, compound interest per se, over 30 years, I mean, that's an amazing investment, and I'm surprised that more and more people are doing it. But we obviously see that the Forbes 400 have been and doing it, and it's helping them keep them on that list for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we started, we talked a little bit about Gary Keller's book, The One Thing. And, what's your one thing? What's something that's important to you in your business now? And what kind of advice can you provide to the entrepreneurs and others that listen to the show?
Well, I have really struggled over the years with time management and balancing my work and home life, my family life, and all that. And the Gary Keller's book, The One Thing, but more importantly, joining his monthly mastery organization, which is really inexpensive, has been tremendously helpful for me. And implementing just a few of the systems he doesn't even get into in the book, but through this little club, if you will, has been tremendously helpful. The One Thing helps you focus on your big lifetime goal, the one thing you really want to get done in your life, and it's actually up to 7 things, by the way. It's because there's 7 areas of life that Gary goes into in the book that you need to have one thing in each, like your family, your business, your other things. So it's a big focus on a big long-term goal, but it's also one thing, meaning this. How does that dial down to what you need to do in your 10-year goals to hit that long-term goal, and then your 5, and your 1 year, and then your 1 month, and then what do you need to do this very hour, Michael, to make sure you're on track to hitting that goal? So it's one thing this hour, it's one thing in this life. Now, my big why in my life, and I've got several, but one big one is I want to invest and I want to influence others to invest a total of $1 billion or more to fight human trafficking and rescue its victims. And a lot of people hadn't heard about this until recently. But Michael, I did a quick calculation. Do you know if you took the record, and I don't mean average, I mean the record annual profits for Apple, Nike, General Motors, and Starbucks, record annual profits, added those together, double that number, that's less than the estimated annual revenues generated by human trafficking right now worldwide. This is an epidemic. And that's a really, really big number. But if you take it down to one individual person, one individual girl in many cases, their owners, if you want to call it that, can benefit, can profit up to $500,000 a year from that one individual. Now think about what that means, Michael, to that individual. Think about that. I want to believe that if I was alive in the United States in the 1800s, I would have been fighting slavery. And if I would have been an adult in the 1960s, I would have been fighting, for civil rights in the U.S. Well, this is slavery. And this is a civil right that's been ripped away from millions of people. And so while my heart's beating on this planet, I figure I might as well do something to change history. And so I am trying to get the word out about this. I'm trying to raise money to do this. I've got a board meeting tonight with an organization called Freedom Place. And there's 5 of us who want to build. It's called freedomplaceproject.com. We are trying to build office complexes in major cities, and we want to use 100% of the developer profits to fight human trafficking and rescue its victims. And so this is one of the things I'm doing to this end right now.
I am so thankful for you and that you are doing that, because those numbers that you started off with are just absolutely staggering. And you said just one person can generate to their quote unquote owner $500,000. And my hunch is, in many of these situations, these individuals own more than one individual, and it's disturbing. I've got 3 daughters of my own. I can't even begin to fathom the pain that their parents would feel in the situation if one day their child or younger daughter was taken away and they had no idea where they are, no way to communicate, and they could be anywhere on the planet and we don't know. And I know, because there's been some stories as it's been coming to light more and more, and I'm hopeful that that this will continue to be pushed towards the forefront so we can eradicate it once and for all. But I know that these types of situations are happening in large cities all over the planet, and in small cities too, and everywhere in between, based on these numbers. So I hope that my listeners will, and again, all of the sites that Paul has listed will be in the show notes and all that. But I hope that everyone will do their part and contribute to this cause to help eradicate this. I mean, I can't think of a better cause to support,
Thanks, Michael.
help our fellow humans, because that's what we all are. We're all humans in this situation. We're all on this one big floating globe, flat or round. It doesn't matter to me. It's still ours. And we collectively need to help each other and protect each other from situations like this, because it's wrong and it needs to end. So I appreciate you and your cause and everything that you're doing on that, because again, as entrepreneurs, we all have a calling to do something. We feel that we're using our gifts and our skills to do something for others, and we can also, give and support organizations that fight things like this, that fight for the humanity and for people and the best for them. So we'll definitely have all that information in the show notes. So going back to one thing, when you look back at your career and you look back at all of the things you've done, what was probably what would be the highlight? What would be something, and you've had a great career and you've had a lot of experiences, and I'm sure a lot of things, you stumbled upon, and some things you're like, okay, let's do this. And it happened to go as planned, which doesn't happen in the entrepreneurial world anymore. But what's one thing that I guess you'd be most proud of that you've accomplished so far?
Well, yeah, I'd love to tell you briefly about my worst real estate investment, and it has a happy ending, actually. I had $1.9 million in the bank, I think, in 1997 when I sold my company. And 10 years later, I found myself $2.5 million in debt. And a lot of that was based on a lot of these waterfront lots that we were buying to improve and then flip. And of course, the recession hit. It was actually late 2007. We were already in the recession in our area. And we found ourselves with our back against the wall. It looked like, bankruptcy kind of made sense on paper. And a couple things happened. Number one, we had this, all my income was from real estate. Number two, my investments were all in real estate. I don't recommend that, by the way, having it all tied up in one thing that can go down the tubes. But also, my partner said he was going to need to exit. He was not going to be able to share in the interest payments anymore, starting in a month or two. And this was late 2007. And I was sitting in my chair one morning, and I was actually meditating, which I try to do on a regular basis. And I got this idea: what would George Mueller do? George Mueller was he lived almost all the way through the 1800s in Bristol, England is where he ended up. And he actually housed, I think, up to 10,000 total orphans during his whole lifetime. And he did it without actually asking anybody for a penny. He actually basically just raised all this money through faith and through mindset and through just basically being in a place where he was taking care of others, and he realized that he would be taken care of. And I thought, what would George Mueller do? And I thought, wait, George Mueller, first of all, wouldn't be in debt at all. But if he was, what would he do? And I came to a crazy conclusion that he would give his way out of debt. So I called a few friends together who had been urging me to declare bankruptcy at some point. I called my family together and I said, hey, we're going to give our way out of debt. It might not work. It might be a total disaster, but it can't get much worse than it is. So we're going to start pretending. We're going to start acting like we're making $500,000 a year and start giving as if that was the case, which was a crazy idea. But we started doing that. And 4 weeks later, I stumbled into an idea from an offhanded comment that someone had made at a Subway restaurant. And I actually was able to figure out how to subdivide a 5-acre waterfront piece of land into 5 1-acre lots. And even though it was now the summer of 2008, by the time we did the subdivide, we were actually able to sell all 5 lots and made a significant profit on that, and actually was completely debt-free in 13 months.
That's an awesome disaster to celebration story. And oftentimes, when things seem dark, you said, you meditate, which is something that I do, and a lot of our listeners do as well. It helps you see things and see opportunities clearer, because if you're in that 80-hour grind and you're not really seeing things, and you don't take time to just kind of look around and see what's going on and look for opportunities, there's a good chance you're going to miss it. And if you didn't see that, then you could have had to go down the bankruptcy road, and who knows what would have happened and where you would have ended up. But instead, you found that opportunity. It made itself available. You acted on it, and you came out of it in a lot better shape than I'm guessing you thought, especially at that time of year. Because I remember 2008 and 2009, because that's when I had my burnout and my year of worst case scenarios and all the things that transpired then. I know that time really well. And of course, being in the Detroit area at that particular moment, with the auto sector, basically needing the government to keep cars being built, it was definitely an alarming time. But thankfully we all survived all of that and came out of it, and now things seem to be getting better for most people anyway. So congratulations on that. So
thanks.
If people wanted to reach out to you and find out more about you and what you're doing, what's the best way to find you?
They can check out our podcast, How to Lose Money, or they can find me at wellingscapital.com. That's WELLINGS capital.com. Awesome. And we'll have all of that information and all the links that Paul has shared earlier in the show notes. So make sure you check all of that stuff out. And again, Paul, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your story and the journey and
and the awesome work you're doing, and also your big why. I think that one is going to resonate with a lot of people, and I hope that we all support it the best way that we can and however we can. So
thanks, Michael.
Thank you.
It's been great being on the show. I really appreciate what you're doing. Appreciate the show, and thanks again for having me on.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you. Until next time, everyone, be well.
Hey, it's Michael again. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate it. If you're like many people, you're dealing with some significant stress and possibly approaching burnout. I know how you feel. In 2009, my burnout led to a year of worst-case scenarios. I do not want that to happen to you. If you go to breakfastleadership.com, you can register for a free webinar on burnout prevention, as well as get a free checklist to have successful mornings. Start off each day the right way. Again, that's at breakfastleadership.com. Also, since you are a loyal podcast listener, I'm asking you to like, rate, and review my podcast on iTunes. I look at all the reviews and appreciate your comments, and it helps other potential listeners discover the content I have on the show. I appreciate you, and thanks again for listening.